Welcome to the Toronto Real Estate Podcast. We have a fun one today. We are going to talk about landlords. Today, being a landlord is not as fun as it used to be, and it's becoming harder than ever to be a landlord in Toronto. So today we're going to talk about that, and we're also going to talk about some of the pitfalls to avoid as a landlord in 2025. And who better than we have than the Fox Marin Leasing Team? At least 3/4 of the team is here today. To give you context to our viewers, we have already done, it being end of September, 200 leases year to date at Fox Marin. We work with a lot of investors and landlords. And so we're here to give a little bit more insight as to the good, the bad, the ugly being a landlord in 2025 in Toronto. My name is Ralph Fox. I am the co-founder and broker of record of Fox Marin. And today we have some of my associates at Fox Marin. Sammy, good morning. So great to see you.
Good morning.
Sean Bridge, how are you, buddy?
I'm doing well, thanks.
And none other than Grace Collins. And I just love saying her name so much, I had to say it again. I wish I had an English accent to really give it that oomph. But Grace, so great to have you here as well.
Thank you. I wish you had an English accent too. I'd love to hear that.
Yeah, maybe we should take English accent lessons. I wonder if that's a possibility. But anyways, guys, I'm so glad for you to be here to talk about this topic. We have so many landlords who are so stressed out, myself included. So we're going to get into it. But before we do, I would be remiss to just ask, be sure to hit that like or subscribe button. It really helps with the algorithm. And of course, if you have any comments, questions, concerns, we'd absolutely love to hear from you in the comments section down below. Okay, guys, so let's get into it. The reality check, it's just being harder and harder to be a landlord. In 2020, it used to be considered relatively easy, and maybe in 2015, very easy. But it seems to be getting every year incrementally more challenging as a landlord. What are you guys seeing out there from a perspective as a landlord? Sean, I'm going to start with you because you are really head of leasing for our landlords. So you would have the most experience and the most perspective of all the aspects to this. Where do you think the biggest challenge in 2025 is to being a landlord?
Yeah, biggest challenge at the moment is definitely the carrying costs for your landlord's rental suites. It's something that a lot of landlords are having a lot of troubles kind of seeing the long-term benefits of, right? So they think that it's still 2023 at the peak of the rental market where they can still get top dollar for their rental unit. And rents have, they've come down. So they want those 2023 prices. And I have to go in and tell them the hard truth. We can't get those prices anymore. You're going to have a little bit of a haircut each month on your rental. And a lot of landlords are having a lot of trouble seeing past that.
And how do you show them this? Because I find a lot of landlords will tend to have arbitrary numbers, either based on what they had gotten before in the past. Like I've had somebody in here since 2022. Why are you telling me now I'm getting $200 less when my mortgage costs, I'm on a variable, the costs are a lot higher, maintenance has gone up? How do you sort of walk somebody through that?
My biggest thing is just showing landlords what is currently on the market and what is recently leased in the building and in the area. And, when we show them those hard truths, they kind of have to come to their senses that if we do list way higher over the expected rental value, there's going to be a lot of troubles renting out their suites. I have a current rental at the moment. It is very overpriced and the landlord is refusing to drop the price, and their rental is unfortunately sitting.
And it becomes a real problem because landlords often get so hung up on the rent, they don't think about the costs of having a property sit vacant for 2 or 3 months. Sammy, you're nodding about that. I can see you've had some conversations with landlords on this topic. Like, how do you think that's affected landlords in this environment, not necessarily understanding the costs of overpricing and being vacant?
Well, I had an example just yesterday. A previous landlord client reached out saying, my tenant has reached out and asked if I could give them a rent decrease because they think that rents have come down. I said, well, they have. So let's look exactly at your building. So we did the same thing Sean does. We looked at recent comparables, what's been sitting on the market. And luckily, places in her building are renting at the same price that we rented hers out a year ago. However, I explained to her that if you do let this tenant go and they find a new rental, that will cost you commissions, and it will cost you may have to paint. We don't know what the tenant's done to the unit. You may have to repair some things. What if it sits on the market for a month, 2 months, and then you're out? If you basically amortize that over 12 months, what is that costing you? So why don't we look at what does the tenant want and how can we come to an agreement here? Because it's a pain in the butt for everyone for this tenant to leave. I think they ended up giving around $100 discount and everybody was happy, but that could have cost her $200 to $300 more a month by getting a new tenant in. So we really had to understand what the cost of both scenarios was.
And also what the value is of having a great tenant who's not causing problems and paying rent on time. There's a lot of value to that in this environment, given all the challenges that landlords face with the landlord tribunal. Grace, you're nodding a lot. What are your thoughts on that?
I was just going to bring up that point. I think sometimes landlords tend to get lost in the monthly costs that they're seeing on their side. But something that I always try to remind landlord clients that I work with is that the cost of having a good tenant is way more important than anything else. Finding good tenants right now is really, really hard. I'm finding that sometimes we're going through 3 to 4 offers before we're even finding someone with a strong enough application to even consider renting to. I think, unfortunately, that's just a reflection of the macroeconomic environment that we're in right now. And so, like Sammy said, keeping someone that is a quality tenant and you have had no problems with, I think should be people's number one priority at this point.
For sure. And it's kind of like dating. Somebody might look great on paper, but you don't actually know until you consummate your relationship and you now have a tenant in there. You only know somebody's paying good rent and paying on time and being responsible when you actually know that. You can only make mitigated assumptions based on somebody on paper or even how they come across in an interview or face-to-face meeting. So when you have somebody good in there, there is a tremendous amount of implied value with keeping them. Well, one of the other things I will touch upon is the increase in maintenance fees. And it's something prior to COVID where $1 a square foot seemed just excessive. But when we've had COVID, one of the things from a maintenance cost for condo landlords specifically is with more people living in buildings that weren't meant to have that amount of people living there almost 24/7 and working from home, it's put a lot of pressure on buildings that just weren't built to have that type of infrastructure or usage. And so what's happened is we've seen a dramatic increase year over year since COVID on maintenance costs, where we're getting closer to that $1, starting to become closer than to the norm than being an outlier. So costs for maintenance fees are going up. Obviously, we know mortgage costs are going up. And then one of the challenges, and we'll talk about rent control in a minute, meaning that if you own a property as a landlord prior to something that was built in 2018, none of these increase in costs are really taken into consideration. Only theoretically some type of a calculation that looks at inflation, but doesn't take into account all of the incredible extra costs that landlords are having to carry in addition to increased mortgage rates. Sean, you are nodding your head. Let's talk a little bit about rent control in Ontario and how that has affected the market from the perspective of a landlord.
So, as you said, Ralph, rent control, any building or a space inhabited prior to November 2018 is subject to rent control. Mm-hmm. So that is the Ontario government setting the max amount that a landlord can increase the rent. And for 2025, for example, the rate was 2.5%, which, looking in the grand scheme of things, doesn't, come up with inflation as much.
Not even close. It lags behind not just inflation, but just increase in maintenance costs, which tend to rise about 7 or 8%. There are so many other factors that are going up that really makes it unfair. And it's one of the components to a landlord versus a property that was built after 2018, where a landlord is able to increase the market rents. However, we're in an environment where there's downward pressure on rents, where rents in some cases are down as much as 10% year over year. And so we're all for free markets, but at the same point in time, there must be an acknowledgement that we basically have two types of markets in Toronto before 2018 and after 2018. And one of the other things, and maybe Grace, you can touch upon this, is how as a tenant, you'll have a lot of rental clients looking for rent-controlled buildings versus non-rent controlled buildings.
Always. I feel like that's a conversation that I have all the time with people when they reach out initially and we're going through kind of what they're looking for in their rental search. Like 8 out of 10 people always will either write into a submission they send over or say in conversation, like, I need to be in a rent controlled building. I find that sometimes evolves as we're like searching and looking at places and they realize that a lot of the inventory we're seeing online is actually post 2018, and just kind of talking to them about rent control in a factual, standpoint of, yes, your landlord may be able to raise the rent however much they would like to, but if you're a good tenant, circling it all back, they should want to keep you more than anything else. And it just gives them the ability to react to the market. And like you said, in this case, we're not seeing rent skyrocket. And so if a landlord tries to do that to you, maybe it's a situation you actually just want to get out of.
Exactly. And as a renter, it allows you to also be very fluid, looking for better opportunities as markets shift. And if you have a good relationship with your landlord, both from the landlord perspective and the tenant perspective, then that's worth a lot, like all relationships. Sammy, any thoughts on this?
Yeah, going back to what Grace was saying, I do notice a lot of tenants say, I want to be in a rent-controlled building. However, the other people that don't seem to, I wouldn't say they don't care, it's just they prefer to be in a newer building, so they would have to. But as long as they are educated on that topic, because some of them don't know what that means. So as long as we're educating, I think that's really important.
And from the perspective, Sean, of a landlord, we all know how, and we'll talk about the LTB, or this will be a good lead into the LTB. Tell me about your experience with the LTB from the perspective of a landlord and the rights that they have.
Yeah, so Landlord Tenant Board, we've all heard it before, they very highly favor tenants. So that's why it's so important to really be very choosy when selecting a tenant. In the past, so kind of around COVID, leading up to the past few years, wait times of the Landlord Tenant Board, we are seeing between 8 to 12 months to get a hearing. So, let's say you want to try and evict a tenant, you apply day one, and then as minimum is 8 months later, then you can kind of start the eviction process. Those times have, they've gotten a lot better, and the Landlord Tenant Board seems to be picking up their socks, but we're still seeing on average between 4 to 6 months before you can get a hearing with them. So although they have done a significant amount of catch up, 6 months still is quite a long time to evict somebody. That's 6 months without rent potentially. And it can hurt a lot of landlords.
And once the landlord actually gets there, what are the chances that they'll actually get a fair hearing, and who or what most likely is going to be the outcome from the perspective of the landlord?
Yeah, so you better hope that all your I's are dotted, all your T's are crossed, because one tiny little mistake, the landlord's throwing it out. Or not the landlord, the Landlord Tenant Board is throwing it out, excuse me.
Exactly. And most often the case, you just aren't going to have the rights that you would assume you would, being an owner of the property. We have one unfortunate situation after doing hundreds and hundreds of leases. And this is actually a really interesting story where we rented it out to somebody who seemed great on paper, and they subletted it to a family member, and the family member just moved in there without any consent, without any permission. And that person has been causing so much problems in the condo building with substance abuse, with police showing up, with fire departments showing up, that the condo corp has said, we are going to take action. But because they can't take action against the tenant, they're going to take action against the landlord. And the landlord has very difficult recourse in dealing with their tenants. And this is one of those situations where the condo corp has far more power over a landlord and vis-a-vis their tenant than the actual landlord does of their tenant. How does that seem fair to you, Sean?
Oh, it's absolutely not. It puts the landlord in an impossible position, rock in a hard place. They have no power whatsoever.
And it's a real frustration. And I now can't tell you like how many people have basement apartments and they're so reluctant to rent out their basement apartments because they know the problem if they have a bad tenant, that they can't get rid of the tenant. Have you guys ever had those conversations? Because I know of a lot of people who could rent out their basement apartments who choose not to because this is where they live. And if they get stuck with the tenant, they can't get rid of the tenant.
Well, I could rent out my basement, but we choose not to for exact same reason. Or
Really?
you could do Airbnb and maybe put it at a month, a minimum month, but you could have issues there, right? Everybody's
Exactly.
home is their safe space, and inviting outside people into it without knowing them. I've heard horror stories on Airbnb long term as well, where people were trying to vet the incoming tenants or incoming residents, and that didn't work. There was someone else who moved in, and the place was trashed. So it's just an issue all around.
Yeah, and there's just so much talk in the media about the missing middle in mature neighborhoods where that's where we could really use the housing, not at City Place. And yet it's all locked up because people are sitting on the ability to rent out their properties affordably, and yet they can't or choose not to because they basically will be giving up all the rights as a homeowner to essentially a stranger.
Yeah, it's a scary thought. Like Sammy said, I think home is where people feel safe and is their, respite from the outside world. And so letting in someone that you
Can't get rid of.
You're stuck. A Zoom call with a tenant for 5 minutes only goes so far in showing you their personality and what you're getting yourself into.
Exactly. And so it's not just landlords, but it's homeowners really face a problem because the rules and the laws are so skewed against landlords, and the system really is broken. And I think if they wanted to bring housing affordability back to Toronto, fixing this problem and letting landlords have control within reason of their own properties would be a really good first step to opening up inventory. And it's one of the things, if you follow the incentives, you'll understand the outcome. And right now, there's less and less incentives for anybody to want to become a landlord. And it's becoming less and less so all the time. Now, there's still great opportunities long-term in owning Toronto real estate, but it's really important to understand what all the challenges are so that you can go about doing it and mitigating any long-term potential problems. What about the challenge of finding, and Grace, this is something you mentioned, the challenge of finding quality tenants. How does that resonate with you?
Yeah, I'd say there's really not many out there right now. I think, like I mentioned previously, there's a reflection in the market of all of the macroeconomic dynamics that are going on right now. And so when I'm working with landlord clients and we're going through tenant profiles and all of the supporting documents that we get, it's a lot of trying to piece things together and figure out where income is coming from. I feel like I'm always having conversations too on the tenant side of people that are self-employed and making sure that we are presenting them in a way that actually shows all of the income that they're bringing in, so that we can package them up in a way that makes sense to somebody on the other side. I always tell tenants that I'm working with, the last thing we want to do is submit all of your supporting documents and leave the other side asking questions. We want to make sure it's thought out and can be easily understood by someone that has no idea who you are. And I think that's really, really important.
Yeah, it's crazy. Like, I've been CC'd on some of Sean's correspondence with some of our landlord clients. And it's just so interesting because some of them I'm like, offer submitted number 17, offer submitted number 18. Like, what is that like, Sean? With so many properties, we have to go through a lot of offers before we see something that looks like they could be a good fit as a potential landlord. Like, how many offers sometimes will you see on properties before we actually accept one?
Yeah, I've been lucky in the past few months. It hasn't gotten too high. I'd say no more than 5. But I think you love this one. One of my first rentals that I did for 2025, we definitely got into the double digits. And it's just so draining because each offer review I send to the landlord, it takes me a good half hour to an hour to prepare it and present it to them. So when I'm in double digits, that's, minimum 10 hours that I put into just submitting these offers to the landlord without doing any due diligence or, past work other than just presenting it.
And we did a whole podcast on this before about fraudulent paperwork, which is just a whole other topic. Can you just give me a bit of a rundown for our viewers on what you're seeing?
Again, I saw a lot of fraudulent stuff at the beginning of the year. Thankfully, the past few months has been really good for not seeing a lot of fraudulent documents.
Huh. Why do you think that is?
Ooh, that's a great question. I have no idea.
Okay, better vibes. Let's call it that.
Yeah, better vibes, sure.
Maybe word has gotten out, don't mess with Sean Bridge.
Honestly, that could potentially be it, because I've definitely worked with a few realtors, numerous times, and some of them, they know now, okay, present a good offer. And if they don't, then I don't want to say tear their head off, but I'm going to tear their head off. Going back to Grace's point, we see a lot of agents submitting offers with the supporting documents that they've just received from the tenants, just sent to the listing agent as is. Whereas our team's really good at collecting all the supporting documents and preparing a story behind it so that when we are sending it to a listing agent, there are no gaps, there are no things that the listing agent has to figure out. A lot of what I do is piecing things together and making sense of an offer, making sense of supporting documents, which I hate doing. That shouldn't be part of my job. I should be sent a very professional, well-presented offer where I shouldn't have to ask a lot of questions.
And Grace, I know this is more specific to the landlord side, but let's just dip into this for a second. As a realtor working for a tenant, how important is paperwork and how important is packaging up your clients so that you can tell their story?
So incredibly important. I'd say when I'm working on the landlord side, I always think back to what I do for my clients and our team does for our clients when we package people up and send in rental offers where everything is clean, everything is in one file, so it's easy to read through. We call out the important things that people should know right in the body of the email. And like Sean said, when you're going through and you're trying to put pieces together, I oftentimes will sit there with a notepad as I'm reviewing and have like pages worth of questions that I then need to call a listing agent for. And I think it just leaves a bad taste in your mouth because obviously you're also communicating with your landlord client and explaining like, this is what we have so far. This is everything that's missing. I'm trying to get all the answers and this is where we're at. And if there's so much back and forth, it leaves a taste of like, well, why aren't they just straightforward and giving us the information that they need? What else is there to know? And so I always like to make sure that my tenant clients are good to go and that we don't come across that issue. And it's always my favorite part or one of my favorite parts when we go to pick up the keys and the other agent is there and they're thanking us for having everything together and making the review process so easy for them, which is always nice to hear.
And it's so interesting at the beginning of the process when you have to explain to your potential new tenant client why they need so much paperwork and why the paperwork is so important, because the landlord is actually scared S-less about who they're potentially taking on because of that liability.
I always tell people the like gathering of your supporting documents is always like the most time consuming and frustrating part, but like we can't move forward until we have it all together, because if we're on the other side and, trying to submit something that's only half complete, you're not going to get anywhere. And so I think that all comes full circle again when we're kind of at the end of the finish line and they're hearing about how things were packaged up and it makes sense. And it's like, hopefully a nice callback to the beginning of like, why is Grace asking for so much?
And it's such a symbol of how broken the system is here in Toronto and Ontario when you require 3 times the amount of paperwork to do a $2,200 lease than would be required to buy a $10 million house in Rosedale. It's unbelievable.
Those are always my favorite conversations to have with people who are moving to Toronto, who might own property elsewhere. And they're like, why is it easier for me to get a mortgage than it is to get a rental? This makes absolutely no sense.
Sammy, you're nodding your head.
Yes, I have that conversation all the time. Like people sometimes will get their back up saying, why do you need all my credit info?
Blood samples,
my SIN number.
samples.
Yeah. A lock of hair, my first child, blood. This isn't okay. So yeah, but it's important for us to disarm these tenants and explain, like you said, why landlords are so hesitant. And the more information and the more correct information, it's so important. And just to have that application filled out fully, there's so many times where there's so many gaps, right? Like their present employer's phone number, it's a 1-800 number. And like that won't suffice. We need a superior. So once you explain this to the tenants and explain it from the lens of the landlord, it disarms them and it helps them understand why we need that information. But in the beginning, it's yeah, it's a little scary for a tenant.
And let's talk about, and for our viewers, Sean is known at Fox Marin for having the most impeccable paperwork. We are all in awe of Sean's paperwork prowess, amongst other things. Sean, can you tell us a little bit about leases and enforceability and clauses and seeing things that you've never seen before, or what it's like when you have somebody say, I have a friend and they have an airtight lease. I'd like you to use this as your template. Like, what do you see? And talk to me in terms about leases, their enforceability, what's important, what's not, and where people get a little bit ahead of themselves.
Yeah, so in terms of what's enforceable or not, you get the most common ones like the pet policies. Right in the lease, it says no pets, absolutely. The landlord's allergic, so can't have them. Unfortunately, no. If a tenant lies to you at the get-go and they bring in a pet, provided the condo building doesn't have a no pet policy.
Because the condos have more power than the landlords or the tenants.
Yeah.
Just remember that, viewers.
Yeah. So if a tenant lies to you, brings in a pet, they can keep it, regardless of what the lease says. Another one we see a lot of is the tenants are responsible for the first $75 of any damage to any of the appliances, for example. A lot of these things, great kind of scare tactics in our schedule of clauses. But unfortunately, anytime you have to enforce that, you have to go through the landlord tenant board. And as we know, the landlord tenant board on average right now is 4 to 6 months wait. And that's only if you dot all your I's, cross all your T's, and everything is absolutely correct. And that's if the adjudicator at the landlord tenant board is on your side. There's so many different factors to even getting it approved. And then once it gets approved, depending on how much it is, you may have to then go to small claims court, depending on the cost of everything. So it's just such a rigmarole. You have to jump through so many hoops. So many of these hoops are on fire. It is difficult.
Anyone like to add to that?
I have found something interesting when I'm reviewing leases on the tenant side and we see these airtight leases that other agents will give us or landlords.
Air
Yeah.
quotes, airtight.
Air quotes on the airtight. And it's interesting because as I'm reading through these for everything that's, not enforceable or not in line with the RTA, I'll redline it and strike it out before, even sending it over to my client to review. And oftentimes I'll send them a side by side so they see the unredacted version of everything that, was in there initially and then everything I've taken out. And sometimes I find that good quality tenants, when they see that, end up not wanting to submit anything because they get spooked on who the person is on the other side and the types of problems that they could encounter with landlord as they get there. And so I think as a landlord, it's so imperative to actually understand what the rules are. So you're not accidentally scaring away quality people and getting yourself stuck in a loop of, getting tenants and agents who just don't understand what the rules are and maybe aren't as high quality as some of the other ones out there who are more educated on things that are going on in the market.
Sammy, you seem very much in agreement with that.
Definitely. Yeah, it goes both ways, right? The more clauses we try to put in there,
the more unenforceable clauses.
Yeah, unfortunately, and and I understand what they're trying to do, and maybe it's more of a conversation that needs to be had over Zoom. But then again, you don't want to scare away the tenant, right? At the end of the day, they just want someone who's going to take care of the place. So it's this fine line between appeasing the landlords, and it goes back to the education piece of what their rights are, what they're able to enforce. And maybe being a landlord isn't for some people. I know that for sure. Like the amount of anxiety some people have surrounding the issue, it might be better for them not to be a landlord. So it's tough. It's definitely tough.
What are some examples of some of the things you've seen either landlords want to put in or things that landlords have put in that have really put off tenants? Like, can you give me some examples of unenforceable items which may make logical sense but just have no relevance whatsoever?
I think the one that I see most often that I strike out all of the time and tends to spook people the most is the paying for the first $100 of every repair in the condo. Obviously, like if an appliance breaks because it's old, that's not the responsibility of the tenant. I think that one tends to be the most spooky for people.
Another one I've seen is if the rent isn't paid on time, There's a $100 penalty every day that it's not paid.
Yeah, that's so enforceable. Oh my God.
And how are we going to do that? Pet deposit, damage deposit, which we know we are not allowed. Trying to get people to give months of rent up front. The first $100, I've seen $100, the first $100 of the repair of an appliance. And I get that one because they're trying to encourage tenants to take care of things in the property, right?
And not get a call to change a light bulb.
Right. Yeah, these things need to be put in the contract, but again, just not enforceable. But I mean, it makes sense just to change a light bulb. Even if the landlord, I've told landlords, why don't you supply them with some light bulbs if you're worried that they're going to change it with the wrong one?
So sometimes there are some like IKEA light fixtures which need these like crazy weird light bulbs. So in some instances, I do feel for the tenant. And Sean, what about you? I know you've raised a couple, and also actually let's just bring this full circle. Like, to the landlord asking for these requests, is it really benefiting them to put these unenforceable conditions or terms in a contract?
Absolutely not helping them at all. It's hindering them. And like Gray said, when you see all these scary clauses, it really puts off tenants. And when you have some quality tenants and we're scaring them away, this isn't the right environment to be doing that. We want to do as much as we can to bring in these quality tenants to us.
And let's get into my favorite topic as a landlord, softening rental rates. What are you guys seeing over the last year in terms of rental rates? Where do you think you're seeing the most softness? And where do you see the most resilience currently in the market?
I'm seeing about $100 to $200 on average, depending on the unit size. I think 1 bedrooms and studios are taking the biggest hit. Most resilience would be in the 2-bedroom category with parking. Yeah, that's what I'm seeing.
And what are you guys seeing with low-rise, like houses for rent? How are they doing?
I think if it's a house or even a condo that is like livable and well kept and has, the amenities that people are looking for, those are very resilient and tend to get a lot of activity. Over the summer, there was one that I remember seeing on the west side, kind of close to Trinity, that had 35 offers on it, which was insane. But I think just goes to show you how limited the inventory can sometimes be of these higher quality rental options for people. And that's where I'm seeing the most resiliency in the market.
Does everyone agree with that?
Yeah, for sure. Homes definitely. As long as it's a good layout, there is maybe 1 parking spot. If it's a hodgepodge and pieced together, or there's 1 bathroom with no tub for a family, doesn't make sense. I've also noticed, though, several homes for lease have listed at one price and then done at least 1 price reduction. So they may be missing the mark a little bit versus based on, previous year pricing. And I've seen some properties lease for less than they've listed for in the past. Like maybe 2 years ago, they had it listed $300 more at least, and now they're having trouble renting it at that price. So that's a sign of the times for sure.
Okay. And where do you guys see rental prices going, let's say, the next 6 months? Are we going to be seeing a continued softening, do you think? Or are we going to see a little bit of a flat line? Or do you think in some segments we might start to see a bit of a bounce back?
I think we're going to see a little bit more softening still. We had a relatively busy summer, which is very typical of the Toronto rental market. Anything past September 1st, we start to see rents kind of come down a little bit. Just not a lot of people want to move in the wintertime, which is understandable in Toronto and in Canada. Moving in the snow is not fun. So I expect in the next 6 months, rents to kind of come down a little bit. And then towards the end of the spring market, very cyclically, they're going to start to come back up again.
And how are you guys seeing the impact on the rental market with most of the major companies now are having everybody come back to the office?
Yeah, I'd say there's a lot more tenants out there now kind of looking to be closer to the downtown core just because they're having to be back in the office so much. And, I'm having conversations with people who have tried to live further out of the city and commute back in 4 times a week. And they're like, oh my God, this is draining. I need to be closer to the office because I work long hours and I don't want to sit on a GO train for an hour and a half every single day.
Oh, God.
So I think that's definitely bringing more people back into the mix.
Interesting. Offsetting lower immigration, which is the story we're hearing, at least for the time being. Okay, so let's talk about some of the mistakes that we're seeing landlords make. Sean, what would you say the top mistake a landlord is making right now in this environment to our viewers?
Yeah, biggest mistake at the moment is landlords thinking that it's still 2023, peak of the market, and wanting the exact same rental rate that they had at that point. So overpriced units.
Okay. And so what would the advice be then in return?
Yeah, my advice is to price things accordingly. And we see that all the time. Things that are overpriced, we see a lot of price reductions in them. And that suites that are priced accordingly will lease out in a relatively short amount of time.
How about you, Grace? What would you say would be another mistake that landlords are making in 2025, and how could that be avoided?
I think presentation of your rental property is really important, both on the
Yes.
listing side with having good photos, making sure all the information is accurate on the listing, but also in person. I find that sometimes, I'll take clients through and we'll walk through a vacant suite and the place will be trashed and not cleaned and, holes in the walls. And I have clients look at me and they say, is this a reflection of the landlord? Like, why don't they seem to care and want me to bring everything up? Like, are they really going to let me move into a place like this? And so I think that sometimes too also scares away good people. So just making sure that like your property is a reflection of who you are as a landlord and that you're willing to take care of your space, I think will attract tenants that are willing to do the same for you
Have you ever walked into rental spaces and just felt dead energy?
all the time,
Have you ever walked into rental spaces and gotten the heebie-jeebies?
all the time.
Should landlords wipe down their countertops,
God,
Sean?
no.
Very infrequently.
But they should when their properties for rent. Like, it's so important with so much inventory, or a lot more inventory than we're used to really have the top presentation. It will give a prospective tenant the utmost confidence in you as their landlord, and that you're not hiding anything, and that you'll be diligent and on top of things. It is the greatest way to say that you're a great landlord, having an incredible presentation of your property. Sam, I'm going to go back around to you. What would say would be another mistake landlords are making in 2025, and what could be avoided?
I think having the right team is really
Yeah.
helpful. A team who has a strategy, a system, like Sean mentioned, for not overpricing, for what Grace said about marketing the property appropriately, and then, of course, vetting the tenant, having a
Yes.
system for vetting the tenant. Sean has a great program. I think it might just be on his computer for finding fraudulent documents, which is incredible. So having that process in place and a team that can back you up and has the experience, that goes a long way.
How many calls have we gotten from landlords who tried to do it yourself or use an unexperienced realtor to rent out a property and then ended up in a real problematic situation with a tenant and paid some crazy ultimate price for it? So having that proper professional team is really important. But I think probably the top mistake that a landlord would make would not properly be vetting their tenant and really going through their due diligence of their tenant. Sean, why don't you speak to that?
Yes, we've talked about it a few times in this podcast.
But this is like this is the North Star. If you're a landlord or an aspiring landlord out there, this is really what you should be focused on.
Yeah. Again, going kind of back to the landlord tenant board, when you do have a bad tenant, again, we're still seeing 4 to 6 months wait for any hearing. So when you're doing your proper due diligence and finding a really good tenant, they're worth their weight in gold, and you want to keep them for as long as possible. And when you don't do your proper due diligence, when you aren't properly vetting the tenants, when you are skipping past this fraudulent documents, that's when you're getting yourself into a really sticky situation. It's never, ever good.
And these horror stories can happen regardless of how much due diligence you do. Like the story I was talking about earlier, they were very, very well vetted, and then somebody else just moved in. So you can't always be 100% sure, but you can really, 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 really reduce your chances of having issues when you do this amount of legwork out front. I highly recommend doing a Zoom call and seeing the whites of somebody's eyes. I think that says more than what you could ever see on paper about somebody. The other advice I'd have to a landlord is don't be super strict with somebody's covenant. It's reasonable to assume that when somebody was 22, they may have missed a payment on Rogers. I wouldn't necessarily think that somebody would be a bad tenant if they had a couple blemishes. I think it would actually make them a little more normal. And maybe even give me a little more trust in the credibility of the package that was presented. So do your due diligence, do your research, trust your gut on how you feel about somebody, and really, really make sure, as Sammy had suggested, that you have a great team who really has the experience and the instincts that comes with having a lot of experience and systems to be able to guide you to reduce your chances of having one of those horror stories as a landlord. Does anyone else want to add in here any potential mistakes that they've seen landlords make, or any concerns, or do you think we've pretty much covered it?
No, I just want to add the program that Sammy thinks that I have is that to vet tenants and do the due diligence. It's up here, not on my computer.
Well, that
is a program operating
that is an
system.
invaluable.
Like it sometimes.
Yeah, we highly recommend you watch the Fraudulent document podcast that I did with Sean, where he can just show you how he can look at fonts and see a mismatch in fonts that would give him an indication of a fraudulent documentation. We go into that one in detail, so that's a great one. Okay, guys. Well, I think this was a really good, fun, exciting conversation. Definitely a challenging time over the last couple decades, probably the most to be a landlord. But if you have the right team, if you have the right systems, if you're approaching it from the right standpoint, you can still be very successful as a landlord in Toronto. It just really requires a lot more upfront due diligence and really understanding the market and the market fundamentals to be able to get through a bit of a challenging time in the market to hopefully see better days in the future. Grace, Sean, Sammy, thank you guys so much for joining us. If you've made it to the end of this conversation, thank you so much for giving us your most valuable asset, which is your time. And hopefully you've taken away a little bit of our knowledge and experience that we've had in the market. Please be sure to hit that like or subscribe button. If you have any comments, if you want to share any landlord horror stories, we'd absolutely love to hear from you. Thanks again for tuning in, and we look forward to seeing you guys next week.